have your attention before we start things this evening. Delighted to welcome the Yes But Are We Enemies crowd here tonight, so a round of applause please. Thank you. My name is Amy, I run the communications and events here at the centre, so before we get things going, I won't be telling people off throughout the night, I promise. Before we get things going tonight, I just need to run through some brief announcements. If you've got a phone on you, make sure it's on silent or turned off. If you're on Twitter, our hashtag for the night is YBAWE, right?
How can we do Twitter for fun?
Silent. It's silent.
Ah, see.
There's an or in there. You have the option. And in case of an emergency, if you can head back down the staircase you came up and just head outside the front door. And if for some reason the staircase is obstructed, you'll be heading out those lovely windows out the back. So I think we're going to be starting the next hour with a panel discussion. Our lineup this evening, we have Susan Tomaselli, editor of Force Literary Journal. Panel members Rob Doyle, you're not sitting in the order of the list, this is okay. Christodoulos Makris is then next to him. We've got Stephen Fowler and Kit Fryatt. So a round of applause to start the evening.
Good evening everyone, I'm Susan Tomaselli and welcome to the Dublin leg of the Yes But Are We Enemies project. This is the serious part of the evening, where I attempt to codify the enemy project, and then the second part of the evening will attempt to undo that with any luck. I'm joined by enemies curators Stephen Fowler and Christodoulos Makris, and enemy collaborators, but not together, Kit Fryatt and Rob Doyle. Stephen Fowler is the author of 6 poetry collections, including Enemies, which is here and for sale, The Rottweiler's Guide to the Dog Owner. He is poetry editor of 3M magazine and is a martial artist and vanguardist. Christodoulos Makris is a poet, editor and curator based in Dublin. His collections include Spilling Out the Mother Tongue, Muse's Walk, and the forthcoming Architecture of Chance. He is co-editor of the Mexico Ireland Anthologies Centrifugal. Kit Fryatt lectures at the Latter-day Institute of Education and coordinates the Irish Centre for Poetry Studies. Recent books include Rain, Don Can, Turnpush, Turnpull, and the County Durham Miners' Granddaughter's Farewell to the Harlan County Miners' Grandson. She also runs a firm in Apfel Press. Rob Doyle is a short story writer, essayist, and author of the mystery novel Here the Young Men, which is published in Ireland by the Press and in Bloomsbury in the UK today. Stephen, if I can start with you. Hello. Could you tell us a little bit about the Enemies project, including the name and how it all began?
Sure. It began quite recently, the Enemies project. I run a project with 3am magazine called Maintenant, which was a series of interviews with contemporary European poets. Because I got into Europe to a few poetry festivals, even though I've only been writing for about 4 or 5 years, and I realised that everyone in the English language world, their knowledge of European poetry was completely ossified. It was all these post-war figures that were completely untouchable and nearly dead, if not dead. And I found that there was loads of people writing who were incredibly exciting and interesting and reflected the population transitions, new technology, cross-language stuff. So I did this interview series, and part of that was countries asking me to put on readings in London, slightly against my will at first, to be honest, for their poets visiting. And what I found from that was just putting them on in a place like this, say 3 Romanian poets, and like tonight, no one came. And so I started to introduce them to local poets in London and have them collaborate together as a way to kind of get them to know the community in London, but also to have a better, richer experience. And this happened at the same time that I got asked to do a few collaborative projects with composers and musicians. And it just kind of sparked the collaboration with this beautiful Trojan horse to get people to experiment in text to more avant-garde kind of poetries, and to bring communities together, because it sits to the side of all the old hierarchical nonsense which has dominated much of British poetry over the last 30 years. So I applied for a bit of funding, got a bit, did a lot of events and exhibitions and programs for a year in England, and then this year opened it up to different nations using that Maintenant experience, I suppose. And this is the 5th country that we've done an Enemies in this year, and we'll be another 7 next year. So.
Christodoulos, you helped extend the project into Ireland. How has the reception been so far?
The reception from everybody has been overwhelmingly good. What I would like to say is it's been diverse in different cities, and that's what we try to achieve. Because what I wanted to bring enemies to Ireland was because I sense a division between different kinds of scenes in Scotland. So we tried to integrate them and bring different people together, perhaps to collaborate. People from poets with different poetic sensibilities, perhaps at times, and see where that space takes us. Collaboration being one way of experimenting with
avant-garde as well, is there? Would you say it's a tradition of avant-garde poetry in Ireland? I come up with the more English avant-garde poets and Irish ones. Have I been looking in the wrong places?
Well, I think there is a tradition, but it's perhaps not very visible. It happens in small circles, like I suppose elsewhere too. I tend to look outside for models. I looked at what Stephen was doing, and I was very keen to work with him to bring this model to Ireland. But I think there is a lineage, an experimental lineage, which I think is starting to bear a bigger influence in how poetry is being written in Ireland. Slowly, but it's happening.
Certainly, I knew an Irish avant-garde, a migrated one, an exiled one. I mean, all of my experience of Irish poetry, apart from people who are so famous that you can't miss them, has been people in London who have great ties to the Irish community who moved to London, like Chomhairle from Maggie Sullivan, or people like Stephen Mooney and Aidan Ricardo, who's reading tonight, and Becky Cremin and Philip Terry, Marcus Lees. You know, there's a huge amount of really Pascal O'Loughlin, Sarah Kelly. There's an incredible amount of really strong presence of Irish avant-garde in London, but I don't think they felt like they could identify their nationhood as a distinct thing for whatever reason. So I certainly experienced an Irish avant-garde. It's not the only reason why I wanted to come here. You know, I always wanted to come here, but definitely a huge part.
Would you say there's a tradition of like a steamy school of poetry slowly emerging?
Against
the Heaney school?
We will see. Perhaps in 5 years' time we'll look back on what we're doing here now and how things are developing, which I think are developing in an exciting way. Particularly with the multinational element, the technological element, entering how poetry is being written, how it's being published, how it's being received, what the processes are in creating it, the whole disjunctive thing that's happening. I think there will be, it's not so much a reaction against it, just for the sake of a reaction against it, but there has been it has been so dominant, that mode of writing, that something, we need to look elsewhere too, for forms and models and processes.
I've noticed something that's not, whereas there's people in England who I've got no problem with, but a lot of people in the avant-garde really talk a lot about as these exemplars of repression. You know, people like Kingsley Amis or Andrew Motion, you know, generations of people who actively try to suppress at other times. I don't think people think that about Heaney, not the Irish people I've spoken to. I had a few people want to...
No, he's well regarded and
yeah,
so
well liked, yeah, I think. So that shouldn't matter. I mean, it's an anecdotal detail, but actually I do think it really affects the way people have a dialogue about it. In the UK, there's still a lot of people trying to create and reinforce the dualism of this person personally repressed us. And we need to do something about it by not really making an effort outside of the pub or something. It's a strange attitude of complacency that a lot of avant-gardists in the UK have. Whereas here, I've noticed that it isn't like that. People are actually quite fluid and don't have like a personal vendetta against the kind of repression. It's more about things are changing. And obviously, outside of Ireland, Beckett and Joyce are not, they're not traditionalists. They're the founding fathers of London and stuff. So it's kind of a strange conversation in a way. Someone who didn't know a lot about Irish, although they don't know about it.
It's almost a dual conversation. Andy Warhol said that art was what you could get away with, but I think we could extend that to poetry and experimental writing as well. Christodoulos, I saw your enemies collaboration with Sam Revere in Belfast, and you had a line that went something like, I insist on the reversal of convention, the muddying of waters, about experimental writing is about, do you think?
I'm not sure what's summation, but it's one of the things that you can do. Reverse convention. The thing about what interests me is a variety of ways of approaching. Yes, you could write a traditional poem, but why just a traditional poem? You can reverse it. You can write things that go against that, or you can try and mix and match in the same space. And what this idea of what collaboration does is brings you sometimes in opposition to somebody else's point of view, somebody else's impulses, and it shifts your perception slightly when you're writing that particular piece, but then something stays with you and carries you on, and you move on to something new that you haven't considered before. And this kind of constant shift, constant interrogation of material, even your own material, I think is what was crucial.
Do we need to maybe start considering poetry as text rather than poetry as poems? Stephen, you're not from a poetry background originally, background's philosophy. Is it a different approach to writing?
I don't think too much about those interchangeable definitions. They're ultimately very valuable. But to me, I try to change the emphasis of the process rather than the product. And I think that's where collaboration actually is the real key to all of the things that I've done, by emphasizing the human relationship in the creative act, by emphasizing the community of people who are making the work, by emphasizing the actual atmosphere in the reading, by the way you communicate to people. It's more of a kind of a consciousness of approach that relates to my idea that experimentation is about necessity. Life in and of itself, without generalizing massively, is untrammeled and not neat, and is in the middle of things, and experience is normally confusing to me. And so I think my work should reflect that, a sense of confusion. And I don't think traditional forms or things that I can pick up from that really does that in the way I want to, as an essential kind of reaction. So I think that's only come about in my mind maybe because I didn't write any poetry until I was like 25, 26. And so it's kind of brand new to me in many ways. It feels like a very essential reaction to forming a community of people, emphasizing the process between those people, and reacting to the experience of life in a way that's actually faithful to that experience, which to me is often quite strange. So my work is strange, I think.
Marcel Duchamp wanted to teach artists to think. Kit, could I ask you, innovation, would you consider it a re-evaluation of values, or a transgression of value boundaries? Specifically in relation to that.
That's a very intellectual question. I'm a very simple-minded person, I think, and my practice as a poet is very simple-minded in some ways. I think to be boring about it, I think I would have to say both. I think personally I have perhaps a preference for transgression, but there's certainly, I don't really see that there's a difference actually, what innovates transgresses and what transgresses in a sense is going to throw up creative energies that innovate. So it sounds like it's an abstract question. I'm very, very bad at abstract thought, as I think a lot of poets are. Steve's a philosopher as well, so he's good at it. But I'm very, very bad at abstract thought, and I get very lost. In fact.
Can I ask you then, why do you press the genesis of vernacular in relation to experimental writing in particular? Where's the name from, and what are its influences?
Okay, so it came out of a sort of a feeling that there wasn't anything very much going on in Dublin for people who were interested in less traditional forms of poetry. And I felt that for some time, but I didn't really have the wherewithal to do anything about it. And then a friend of mine who I'd known many years before in Cambridge, Doyle moved here quite unexpectedly in some ways. He just got a job here, moved here, and we sort of egged each other on to actually do something about it. As I said, we're not good abstract thinkers, so we took the name from a concrete poem, a very famous concrete poem actually, Reinhard Doyle's Worm.
Could you explain concrete poetry?
Yeah, concrete poem. A concrete poem is a poem which has a visual element of some kind, which is as much about its appearance on the page or in a space as it is about articulating sound or about presence, in kind of just textual reading. So it's a poem which has any visual kind of element, any sort of where, I suppose, where poetry and graphic design meet. That's one kind of concrete poetry, where poetry and installation art meet. That's another kind. And this one is a kind of graphic design one. It's the shape of an apple, made up of the word apfel, except for one little tiny space which says the word worm, which is the German obviously for worm. There's a worm in the apple. It's a very, very, very famous concrete poem, and it's very well known in the States actually. It's like on loads of elementary school classroom walls in America, but it doesn't seem to be quite as well known on this side of the Atlantic. So we named it after that because we wanted it to be both interested in experimental text, but also accessible. And we thought that was a good, accessible symbol. There we go.
Was experimental writing a practice that you were always drawn to? Or was there a moment?
Was there a moment? Yes, I think there probably were moments along the way. I did my undergraduate degree in Cambridge, and there was quite a lot of it around. So I encountered people like Doyle Benjamin, Kevin Nolan. I encountered people who were kind of interested in as a Drew Mill and Drew Mill taught me. I went to Jeremy Prin's lectures in Cambridge. I had Jeremy Prin to tea once, which is perhaps still the most exciting experience of my life. And he brought some, he asked us to send him some poems to talk about, and I sent him I sent him Bert Jansch singing Black Waterside for some reason, because I was obsessed with that at the time. And he came back to me, I called on Zoom poem, which was about shamanism, and he came back to me with some recordings, some field recordings of Scottish singers from the 1920s, and all these field recordings of shamans. It was brilliant. And Bryn has this Mandarin reputation. But I found him very accessible and very kindly and very encouraging. So I think that was a good start. And then I discovered some of the more revolutive sides of avant-garde practice in England that Stephen was talking about there, this sense of being kind of hunkered down, this sense of being barricaded, this sense of oppression. Whether that's real or not is a question for another day, but it's definitely a feeling there, and it can be really oppressive in itself sometimes.
Rob, I want to talk to you about experimental writing, but first I want to ask you about your characters. I want to ask you how much your characters permit you a certain artistic freedom. Kit uses quite a lot of characters in some of her poems, but what I mean is it not a collaboration between the author and his characters, which is also a paradox, because fiction is a deliberate construct.
Yeah,
talk a little about your characters.
Sure.
I'm thinking of John Paul Finnegan, and
Right.
I'm thinking of Carrie.
You read that one? Where did you read that?
I'm thinking of Carrie here.
Okay.
But I'm also thinking of Killian Turner. The greatest Irish writer that no one's ever heard of.
So I never really thought of characters, the creation of characters, as a collaboration before. It's an interesting way to put it, but if that's what you're suggesting it is, I'm not entirely sure that I agree. I think for me, a character is a kind of maybe a portal, an opening that allows something in you, the unconscious, to flood through. And what makes a character come alive is that it's charged with your own again, usually unconscious sense of things, your impulses, no matter how strange the character is, no matter how different from you the character is. I think, as Ealaíon says somewhere, even the characters that are most different from the author are products of the author's own deep introspection and the author's own character. So I think that when I create a character, and not all of the stuff I write in the fiction is character-based, but often the character is a kind of shard of myself. And I think that a lot of authors, fiction authors, would find that they have these kind of projections of some aspect of their own self, or some amalgamation of aspects of their own self, which they kind of put out there, and they can see it there. So it's not just kind of bubbling down in your own inner life, your unconscious is being projected out into a kind of embodied form. There's different, I suppose there's a spectrum, like Nabokov said that his characters were kind of slaves, they had no freedom whatsoever. They did whatever he wanted them to do. Which, okay, it works for him. Did it work? I don't know. I think maybe you can feel that in his writing some of the time, But then there are other authors who have an almost mystical sense where they say that the character, then my character told me to do this, which I often think is a bit of an affectation. I've never had that kind of, I suppose I'm somewhere in the middle. Not really, no, I don't. I think it's just, for me, it comes with a voice, and if that bubbles up and it feels alive, then I go with it. If the energy is there, and you can see it on the page, you go to bed that night, you wake up the next day, you can tell if a piece of prose is alive. And if it's fiction, if that piece of prose is alive and that character is alive, I think usually it means that it's connected with something deeper in yourself, something usually deeper than the rational, conscious mind. And there are lots of different ways you can dig into that and try to excavate and use that material. That's the energy.
I'm glad you mentioned culture. The book of you all work in or with translation, and of course famously poetry is what's lost in translation. How much are translated works an influence on your work to Rob? I'm thinking specifically of Ealaíon, who also wrote poetry, but also more experimental writers, perhaps like Cortazar and so on. Yeah,
huge. Not necessarily Cortazar, but I would say at least 50% of the stuff I read is in translation, almost to the point where I feel that I'm in danger of losing touch with what makes great English prose, crackling and alive. But I think that I suppose I've always had a kind of lure towards the exotic, not just in writing, but not just in literature, but in life in general. And in literature, that means that I spend a lot of my time reading voices in translation. But there's an interesting consequence of that I've noticed, is that sometimes anything, no matter how banal or how bad the writing, if you read something in translation, almost invariably it will have a kind of aura of strangeness about it, I feel. You can tell that it's been translated and it makes the text not quite right. There's something not quite right about it, and it gives it a real enigma, I find. It makes writing somehow more enigmatic. And I've also noticed, as not in the novel that I wrote, but as I continue to write and continue to read, I've noticed that one of the effects of reading so much and rereading so many authors in translation, Ealaíon you mentioned, but lots of others, Borges, so many, is that my own prose has started to take on a kind of somewhat translated aspect. I look at it and think it's becoming less Irish, maybe less national, and more has a kind of aura of translation to it, even though it's clearly not. And that kind of interests me, because the more I think about it, I see less and less reason to be, completely tied down to a national literature for anybody these days. you know.
Do you agree with that, Stephen, that translation is an enigma?
I definitely agree with what Rob said at the end. I mean, I do think that there's an absolute, a very real, I think population explosion is the thing behind this that no one talks about. They talk about migration, but the world population has doubled, I think, in the last 45 years, so humans get squished together a lot more. It changes everything that they do, from the way they communicate to the way they write. I absolutely agree with that. The other point, the idea of there being like a feeling, I actually kind of feel the exact opposite. I always found myself very early on around people who didn't speak the language the thing was translated from, saying, this is a good translation and this isn't. And I kind of felt, well, if you don't speak the original language, then all you know is the translation. And from the start, all I've ever thought of translated works and works in English, they're the same thing to me, because without knowing the actual language, all you know is that it has been translated. Someone could be lying to you. I mean, in principle, it might have been written in English and they told you it's translated into Russian. So I've never really understood why people have treated translated literature differently. Because that's unless you've got the second language, all you've got is the translation. So this Larkin-esque idea that, like, oh, I don't read poetry in translation. If I have a translation of Rilke, there might be two versions. But apart from that, I've got English Rilke. Rilke could be from Manchester. It doesn't really make a difference to the way I read them or the way I think about them.
I suppose what makes it kind of unusual and enticing, alluring for me is that, sure, even if it's Japanese and I don't speak a word of Japanese, it's the sense that the consciousness behind the prose, behind the work or the poetry or whatever, is not an Irish consciousness, not an English language consciousness, and I suppose that's what I mean by the kind of X factor, which gives it an element of what is this? It's, you know, something.
I read the same. I agree with you, but that is about us knowing the nationality of the author rather than the actual text.
Yeah, okay.
Like if you wrote a novel about a samurai in the 17th century and you've changed your name, I mean, I would probably read it with the same mysticism like Robert Doyle's samurai novel, which I would read, by the way. So no, I don't. And I've had a lot of rows with people about this because I work in European literature massively and I'm monolingual. You know, it's the great shame of my life and all the things I try to do is I don't speak one language. And I like it. I carry it like a heavy wet towel on my neck. Because I go to all these festivals and there's 25 languages and, you know, I'm so sweet, I'm sorry about my English, you know. Because it's the lingua franca, they then assume that I'm lazy, which I, you know, kind of am, I suppose. So there's this almost like it's kind of good, it puts you in the shadows a little bit, and you get to kind of look on into what for example, the path of the poet in any other country apart from an English language one is very different than in England. In England, what you're trying to get, a magazine, then a publisher. In those countries, you get translated. That's a huge thing. Like I've spoken to so many people who have been like, oh, I'll give you a book, would you translate one of our poems, you know, into English or crib translated? So there's a whole different culture about that and what that means. And as an English speaker, I'm in a very privileged position, I always have been. I've always been able to just draw from all these wonderful translations and treat them as though they just began in English. And that's kind of how I read, and that's kind of how I try to think about it, because I don't have the skill to know the other worlds. So.
Kit, you translate, don't you?
I do some. I try to translate from languages where I can work with the crib. I only speak French, so that limits me to things that they translate, or things that are in French, or things that have French translations. I've done quite a bit of work with Occitan though, and so mostly from French translations of Occitan, or translations into English of Occitan. I like working with cribs. It's very interesting because you've got this. Rob was talking about this mediating consciousness. You've got the kind of mediating consciousness of the crib writer there. So there's lots of there are lots of people. There are lots of unseen people in the process, and both the thing I'm doing tonight and the thing I'm doing with Gimpy Campanella on Saturday in London, kind of translation projects which have used cribs a little bit, and which have done some fake translating as well. So yeah, I both enjoy translating and reading translations.
Christodoulos going to talk to you a little about technique. There's a spot on the radio this morning, Hunter Davies, he was talking about the origins of Beatles lyrics. Like, for example, Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds came from a drawing by Julian Lennon. Mr. Kite was composed from circus posters. A Day in Life was newspaper headlines. So the Beatles were even fond text. How useful are avant-garde practices of cut-up, legal, data, sound art, appropriation in the style of Kenneth Goldsmith to your work?
It's something I've been using more and more over the last few years. I think it's tied in perhaps to the idea that we consume so much more text particularly with the internet coming over the past 20 years and more. We communicate a lot more by text. We used to call people, now we text people, we tweet and so on. And there's such a huge amount of material already there that's already wonderful. And choosing what we read or allowing our interests to guide us to texts or that interest us, and how we move from one text to another through hyperlinks and so on. That's something that fascinates me. And I've recently, or more and more, have been treating writing as a form of reading, or as a reflection of how I read, and also as a reflection of how other people read and what other people have to say about events and issues that interest me and interests us in general in a specific space. So yes, the question, simple answer is yes. That's the kind of thing I'm working on now.
Twitter, you use Twitter?
I use it a little bit, but a little bit more, and sometimes a little bit less. Sometimes I go completely and come back. Again, depending on ways, of course, or what interests me. I'm interested in what comes through some days, some other days I am. And I'm interested in chance as well. A lot of the things that we read or we happen to read on the train, or pick up something, we pick up a newspaper, we pick up a magazine, that's just there by a set of circumstances that we have no control over. So that's another issue that interests me. In all the masses of material that's available there, why do we come across something, and where does that take us, and how does it take us there? Is there a mechanism? Is it all random? That's the sort of thing I'm trying to explore currently.
Stephen, can I ask you a little bit about the approaches to the collaborations, without asking you to reveal your tricks? How do the collaborations work? Who did you decide who was pairing with who? Is there some great data? Chomhairle?
The I Ching. It's just the I Ching. No, I mean, hugely on this tour, the model of working with different nations is about co-curating. It's about, and also the community. It really is about that. I wouldn't even begin all the slough of admin and funding applications if I didn't think there was going to be a sense of hospitality and warmth and thirst for kind of the idea. In Ireland, more than anywhere else, and in the last week it's been just absolutely amazing. The quality of the work and the range of the work, and it's so important that people aren't made to feel excluded by the experimentation as well, because obviously I think my reputation maybe is known as a more experimental person, and I think that it's weird to me how poets are unlike any art form, that they only seem to like the kind of poetry that they write. I have a tendency to go outside of my own, and so I read people and ask people to read and collaborate who don't write like me, and I prefer hearing them, to be honest, because they're different than I am. So we really had a mix of communities, and it's been about finding the kind of connections between people, not only in the style of writing, but more than that, because maybe I put together 400 pairs, maybe 350 pairs over the last couple of years, and we grouped that stuff as well. It's about personality, actually. It's not about writing style, I don't think. It's about whether or not two human beings will be generous to each other in that relationship. I mean, there's only been maybe 3 that haven't worked out of all of them. And it's just because people were nice people, but they were precious. They felt like maybe they were being mocked when someone tried something special, or they needed their work. You can't change that. If that's kind of people's attitude towards writing, and even their attitude towards the world, then it's not for them. So I tend to only try and ask people who I think are good human beings. That's maybe the best way to say. And in terms of local expertise, Christodoulos has been the man. And the Irish community that's connected with me and been warm to me is really notable on the internet. Easy, if you want to read contemporary interesting Irish writers, you can. There's no barrier. And so everyone reading tonight, everyone who's read most of the other gigs, by and large, I've read before, not even out of research, but out of just coming across them. Thanks to things like Horse that you do, and Kit's Press, and things like that. There's real ground-up energy. I don't know if that's post-economic slump, we'll do it for ourselves, or if it's a change in tone, but I've been blown away by what's going on right now in Ireland, without sounding puffy, like I'm complimenting people, it's the truth.
Well, the important thing that we noticed, I think, is the thirst that we talked about, the interest. We noticed it in the audience. There was, you could sense that they were looking for something that is somewhat different to what they were getting before. The more formal, the more kind of first-person narrative sort of poetry. We were coming in, they say, well, how does collaboration work? Well, in this way, where we give and take, and we produce something different, and you could sense the interest in all the audiences looked into every venue. And from what we talked about later with people afterwards, it's something that they're taking away with them, and who knows where it's going to lead, what sort of form it's going to take.
I'm actually going to turn it over to the audience now. I think we have time for a few questions if anyone wants to say. Dave?
Yeah, I think Heaney's a really good name that came up tonight because Heaney took a lot of criticism from the avant-garde, but he replied to it. And he replied to it very well. I remember reading his replies and being very impressed by his replies. I'm not going to paraphrase them now, but they're in Then So This Was Stephanie Stone's book. I used to hate Heaney as well. I thought he was repressing me and, a big figure that, was kind of controlling poetry and I'd never get anywhere. And then I read him, to be honest with you. And I love him and he inspires me and so many other writers.